Hey guys, how's it going? It's Danconia and welcome back to the Overwatch League Roundup 2020 Week 4 preview. So, Week 4 should be an interesting one. We travel to Houston and the Revention Music Center for this week, and let's just address something that's been going on. It has been announced that there will be a ceremony at the Houston Outlaws homestand to retire the number that Jake used to wear for the Houston Outlaws during his tenure at the team. Obviously, he's retired and become a caster right now. And it's kind of blown up on Twitter with a lot of people saying, well, why is Jake having his number retired? And I wanted to cover it. So, the league doesn't dictate who retires their number. It's the teams that dictate that. Jake was practically the face of OWL for 2 years. So, I'm not surprised they want to retire his number. This is a Houston Outlaws decision. And what we have to remember is it's the Houston Outlaws homestand. So, if they want to do something like this, they can do something like this. It's their show, they run it to a certain extent, right? Now, possibly a little known fact across the league is that London Spitfire have in fact retired all of the numbers of their 2018 title winning squad. That includes Prophet, because I did see that someone said, well, why isn't Prophet getting a ceremony and having his number retired? Well, Prophet's number is retired. So is Gestures, so is Bedosins, so is Nusses. All of that squad have had their numbers retired at the London Spitfire, so they will never be used again at London. And London might do a similar ceremony when they have their homestand. It just so happens that Houston Outlaws are the first to do this. So I haven't got too much against this ceremony for the retiring of his number, and it'll be a nice thing to do to honour Jake, because he was a very big part of this Houston Outlaws team, and a very big name in the Overwatch esports space. So, moving on then, let's get to it. Standings are on the left. The current standings, obviously, from the end of last week. We have 7 games to cover during this week. Across the Saturday and the Sunday, there will be 3 games on the Saturday and 4 games on the Sunday. We will see the New York Excelsior, the Florida Mayhem, the Toronto Defiant, the London Spitfire, obviously the Houston Outlaws, the Boston Uprising, the Philadelphia Fusion, the Paris Eternal, and yes, for the first time we get to see the Atlanta Reign this season, so that should be really interesting. But without further ado, let's get into these fixtures. So, on Saturday, February the 29th at 8 PM, we have the New York Excelsior taking on the Florida Mayhem. So, Florida Mayhem coming into this, obviously they had an okay week 2, they were in week 2, Florida Mayhem. So, they had an okay week, but they did lose to the Philadelphia Fusion, but I think we expected that. But this Florida Mayhem is no pushover side, and with the New York Excelsior looking not all over the place, but not as polished as we'd like in the past few weeks, there is potential for an upset here by the Florida Mayhem. Do we expect to see an upset for the Florida Mayhem? No, I don't really expect an upset. The Florida Mayhem are more likely to get a result out of their game on the Sunday. But New York Excelsior, this is their only game this week, so I would hope they come in fairly polished and very prepared for this Florida Mayhem side. And I would expect New York Excelsior to come out with something like a 3-1 victory over the Florida Mayhem. But the Mayhem do have the potential to give this a real darn good go. So, after that we have a really interesting match. At 10 PM GMT on the Saturday, we see the Toronto Defiant take on the Atlanta Reign. So, Atlanta Reign, they were very good last season, especially towards the end of last season. They were the only team to beat the San Francisco Shock, our eventual 2019 winners, in those playoffs, knocking them down to the losers bracket where they stormed it. But they're obviously a bit of an unknown entity going into the season. We haven't seen them play yet, but they've still got that really strong roster they've only added to it. So this Atlanta Reign is suspected to be one of the better teams in the league, if not one of the best teams in the league, and should be able, on paper, to be able to compete with the likes of the Philadelphia Fusion. But they've got a lot to live up to if they want to be at that level, and this is the first test of that. We will remember that Toronto Defiant did play the Philadelphia Fusion last week and ran them very close in a 3-2 victory for the Fusion. So, the Atlanta Reign, this will be a very interesting test coming into this season. And their other test actually is pretty tough as well. So this is an interesting week, and it will definitely give us an inkling to where we think the Atlanta Reign are. But I would expect Atlanta Reign to get a victory over the Toronto Defiant here, but it could be quite a narrow one. Moving on, in the last game of that day, for me in GMT, this will be at midnight on Sunday, but in Europe, this will be at 1 AM. Elsewhere, it will still be on the Saturday. But this is the London Spitfire taking on Houston Outlaws. So, the funny thing is, and I mentioned this in the results video the other day, the run of homestands right now, NYXL went 2-0, Dallas went 0-2, Philadelphia went 2-0, the Washington Justice went 0-2. If it follows that pattern, it indicates that Houston Outlaws are going to get 2 wins this week. Yeah, if that happens, I'd be very, very surprised. Houston Outlaws, obviously, what can we say? They've got to make a lot of improvements if they want this to work. The London Spitfire, they haven't, been setting the league alight. But I do say that the second half of that game against Washington Justice is the best I've seen London play in actually quite a while. Even going back to the Jester Bedos and Prophet old roster days at the end of last season. They had that clutch about them. And if they can bring out that second half performance against the Houston Outlaws, it'll be a walk in the park for the London Spitfire to get a 3-0 here. But I don't trust the London Spitfire to do that. It'll be interesting to see what roster they run out with. Obviously, they've been mixing up with Babel and Shui and Bernard and Celestin, so it'll be interesting to see what the Spitfire run. But the London Spitfire should expect to get a victory here over the Houston Outlaws. But the Houston Outlaws do have the potential to take a map, but that would be disappointing from a London Spitfire point of view. London really want to go out here and get a 3-0 victory if they can. So, moving on to the Sunday March the 1st at 6 PM, we will see the Boston Uprising take on the Philadelphia Fusion. Yeah, this probably is going to be a fairly quick game. Philadelphia Fusion should sweep the Boston Uprising fairly easily. We all know the Houston Outlaws Boston Uprising match from last week. It was a Pepega fest. Boston Uprising, they had their really bad moments. Houston Outlaws had their really bad moments. Neither team looks like they're going to be able to get out of that 19th, 20th spot. So I would expect the Philadelphia Fusion to pretty easily 3-0 this match, considering it's the Philadelphia Fusion's only match of the week as well. If the Fusion were to drop a map here, it would be disappointing, I would have thought, considering their previous matches this season so far. I would expect the Philadelphia Fusion to move on to that 5-game unbeaten streak. So, moving on after this, and at 8 PM on the Sunday, we see the Paris Eternal take on the Atlanta Reign. I said the Atlanta Reign's 2 games this week aren't going to be easy. Arguably, the Paris Eternal could be a tougher prospect than the Toronto Defiant. It depends what we see from these two teams. Paris Eternal now with Hambin, obviously, so that improves them a great deal. The Atlanta Reign, these 2 games are going to be a real big test, and this is a game that I find hard to call. I would still back the Atlanta Reign to beat the Paris Eternal, but this is purely on paper because we really haven't seen the Atlanta Reign in action right now. So, we really don't know what to make of this team. They could just storm everything like the Philadelphia Fusion have been doing, or they might be actually a mega disappointment and lose both of their games this week, and all of a sudden we're looking at an Atlanta Reign that could be middle of the league. I wouldn't expect that. I would expect this Atlanta Reign to at least be a playoff team, and if they want to be that playoff team, 2 wins this weekend will serve them very, very well. Moving on to the next game then on the Sunday, and that's 10 PM GMT, we see the London Spitfire in action again against the Florida Mayhem. Now, this is a big test for this Spitfire squad, along with this Mayhem squad, because this is 2 teams that could be battling it out in that middle of the league, that sort of play-in area, and London Spitfire, if they can come out with the, I'm going to keep quoting this performance, but the performance in the second half against the Washington Justice, if they can come out with that, they can go 2-0 this weekend. But I don't think London Spitfire are a very consistent team. So it wouldn't surprise me to see them go 1-1 this weekend and lose to the Florida Mayhem. It wouldn't surprise me, but this game really could go either way, in my opinion. Florida Mayhem have looked good. London Spitfire have looked good at times against the NYXL and against the Washington Justice, so it's a very difficult one to call. Florida Mayhem, though, have got a lot more experience than this London Spitfire squad have. We might have to remember that they have Gangnam, Jin and Yaki in the squad, so that's a really good bit of experience there, and that's why I will back the Florida Mayhem to get a victory over the London Spitfire. It could be a 3-1, 3-2 for the Florida Mayhem. I just think the Florida Mayhem have got a little bit more than the London Spitfire have right now, but there is definitely potential for the Spitfire to take the victory here. And then the last game of the weekend will be at midnight for me on the Monday, 1 AM in Europe. It'll still be on the Sunday elsewhere. Toronto Defiant taking on the Houston Outlaws. Now, Toronto Defiant, they've got the difficult prospect of the Atlanta Reign on the Saturday, but this should be a sweep for the Houston Outlaws. If I think the London Spitfire, for the Toronto Defiant, sorry. If I think the London Spitfire could probably sweep the Houston Outlaws, then the Toronto Defiant really should be able to sweep the Outlaws. Toronto Defiant did look really good against the Philadelphia Fusion, and they should be able to pretty handily dismantle the Outlaws. And to be quite honest, if I was a betting person, a 0-2 homestand for the Outlaws right now is looking likely. But if their crowd can get behind them, they may have that little bit of clutch with the crowd behind them to get that win over the Spitfire, but I think the Toronto Defiant is a step too far. If the London Spitfire goes 0-2 this weekend, that's going to be a really disappointing weekend for the London Spitfire, especially when you look at their schedule coming up. They've got some really difficult fixtures coming up, the Spitfire, so they really want to get a 2-0 this weekend if they can, and put them out of the reach of the bottom teams. Otherwise, they're going to be clawed back in by those teams. So, that is our look at week 4 at Houston. It's going to be really interesting. We're going to see some sweeps, probably like the Boston-Philadelphia game and the Toronto-Houston game, but we're going to see some pretty close games as well, I think, like Paris-Atlanta and London-Florida and Toronto-Atlanta maybe even New York-Florida. Might be pretty close games. And if they are, that should make for a very entertaining weekend. And if it's anything like last weekend, it's going to be an absolute cracker. But, for now, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you liked it, give it a like, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next video. See you then!